cemetery, the annual cemetery walk. I am Remember Baker III. Forgive me as I'm going to be reading quite a bit, as I was given new information today and having trouble remembering some of this information. I would like to thank the Portland Area Historical Society for bringing historical figures to life once a year so we can share the wonderful stories that make this community so admirable. As I said, I Remember Baker III. My story with Portland is my connection with Portland is rather tenuous. I think the only reason I'm buried here is because my son Milo owned a factory, which you may have heard of, in 1847, the Bower and Baker Foundry. They made castings, plows, and other agricultural implements. I, however, was born in Vermont in 1786, where my family was pretty well known. My grandfather, Remember Baker II, is cousins of Ethan Allen and Seth Warner, who all together organized the Green Mountain Boys. When New York and New Hampshire were contesting their boundary, New Hampshire settlers were harassed by New York, who said their settlers had rights to land already settled by others. Ethan Allen's men decided to play Robin Hood and fought back, and this is what led to the foundation of the Green Mountain Boys and Vermont. When the revolution began, militia was already in place. They took Forts Crown Point and Ticonderoga and won the Battle of Bennington. Unfortunately, my grandfather, while preparing for the attack on Fort Ticonderoga, was savagely ambushed and killed by the local Indians, and they decapitated him and placed his head on a pole and marched it around the fort. Some claim he was the first casualty of the Revolutionary War, so I guess there's that. And so my father, Ozzie, was a civil engineer and helped form Fort Wayne for Mad Anthony Wayne of the Revolutionary War general. A little bit of my background: I married Cynthia Standard in 1807, and like many families of the time, we started making our west, looking for new land and opportunities. We eventually settled in Genesee County, New York, where all of our 8 children were born. When the War of 1812 started, I joined the fight and was sergeant in the New York militia at the Canadian frontier near Lake Champlain. Our daughter Laudowski, which is Latin for Louise, was also a very industrious and free-thinking person. Lottie, as we called her, and her husband were missionaries with the Methodist Church. He was the superintendent of education of the Cherokee and Indians in the Indian Territory. Lottie believed in education, and she and her husband planned on moving to the Southwest to offer more educational opportunities to the settlers there. She was a graduate of the Westland Female College in Albion. Her husband died before he could make the journey. Lottie and their 2 boys followed through with the plan. She stayed in Ann Arbor for a while so her boys could get a good education, and then they moved west to Texas. She opened the first free school in the state. Many of her descendants still live there today. Our son Standard, who died before we moved, was an inventor. He invented a spiral spring which made riding in carriages more comfortable. I had to apply for the patent because he died before he could benefit from the rewards of the invention. Sorry. Like most parents, I am very proud of my children. As I said, Cynthia and I had 8. I've already told you about Milo and Alonzo. Our son Lafayette went into law enforcement. First, he moved west and joined Vigilance Command and helped clean up San Francisco after the gold rush. When the Civil War started, he became a spy for the North under General Scott. He was captured a few times, but thankfully escaped, and he eventually became a head of the intelligence service. What he is best known for is helping in the capture of John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln. My nephew Luther Baker also helped in the capture, and Lafayette is credited with helping form what was later known as the Secret Service. Luther settled in Lansing and traveled the country telling about his part in the capture of Booth. And there's a book that he wrote on the capture of Booth, John Wilkes Booth, and you can get it at the Historical Society of Lansing. What I found particularly interesting here, and shows just how bodacious he was, is this, in chapter 2, it's called A Horse's Tale, and at the beginning he writes from the perspective of the horse. To the American public, permit me to introduce myself as Old Buckskin. I am a veteran of the war and a member of the GAR. I am a native of Virginia and am now in 1887, 29 years of age. I was captured in 1862 in my native state by U.S. troops and at once became a member of the 1st D.C. Cavalry. Here I formed my acquaintance of Lieutenant L.B. Baker, my present rider, and we at once became inseparable friends and allies. Together we participated in a large number of battles, raids, and skirmishes. In '64 I was wounded and carried a bullet in my shoulder for 3 years. In 1865, with my friend in command, I led the pursuing party in the capture of J. Wilkes Booth, the murderer of Lincoln. At the close of the war, Lieutenant Baker purchased me of the government, and he and I have since made our home in Lansing, the capital city of Michigan. In my old age, I am tenderly cared for, and I am not an applicant for a pension. And then L.B. Baker writes, the old horse gives his record correctly. I was proud of him and would not have parted with him at any price. He died at the age of 30 years from rupturing a blood vessel while on one of his wonted antics under the saddle, and his demise was the cause of genuine sorrow among a large circle of friends. By request of the faculty of the Michigan State Agricultural College, his remains were presented to the state, were mounted, and are now on exhibition in the museum of that institution. So, yeah, that's enough about me and my family, because that's all I have. Yeah. Oh, actually, well, this isn't, I forgot about the book. I was given this today. This is written by D.P. Thompson. Without this book, the Green Mountain Boys probably would not be as well known as they are. I don't have much more information in that book, but I know she does.
Who were the Green Mountain Boys? I don't know. They were upset because Vermont wanted to be separate from New York, and there was a big internal war. New York wanted not just Vermont but some other states.
Gotcha.
And they were fighting for independence of Vermont. And
The Green Mountain Boys were. Okay.
Yes, Vermont is Green Mountains.
Okay.
And so they were militia. They did all sorts of things that we're going to have today. But they were all in place when the revolution started. And so they were the ones that represented Vermont in the revolution. And my ancestor, Captain Abraham Underhill, was He said my ancestor was a captain under Colonel Ira Allen, who was a brother to Ethan Allen.
Going to meet Flossie Smith, and Flossie has an interesting story. And if you can't hear her, just let her know.
Welcome, my name is Florine Higgins Smith, but my friends and family call me Flossie. I was born October 6, 1886 in Danby Township. My parents were John W. Smith and Alice Higgins Smith. They are over here. They are already the parents of Luella and Carl. This is my gravestone, and Luella and Carl are here also. Carl died in 1892, so it was just Luella and me. My father worked as an elevator foreman, and for several years we lived in Louisiana. We moved back to Portland, and Father worked for Fred Lockwood at the Portland elevator for some time before we permanently moved to Lansing. I went to school here in Portland and even taught school for a while, but I decided that nursing rather than teaching was my true calling. I moved to Grand Rapids to attend nursing school and became a registered nurse. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, I volunteered my services as a nurse. In November, I was sent to Camp Wadsworth in South Carolina for training. After completing training in the May of 1918, our class settled from Hoboken, New Jersey to Liverpool, England. We arrived there on May 25th, and by June 12th we were in France. I remained in France until February of 1919. My unit sailed back to the United States and I was discharged from the Corps in April of 1919. I can't begin to describe the conditions we saw in France. We, like all the soldiers, we suffered terrible hardships, and unlike the soldiers we were treating, we received no recognition for our work. We're not commissioned and served at the whim of our commanding officers. It wasn't until 1920 that nurses could receive the relative rank of lieutenant, captain, or major. In fact, it took until 1947 for nurses to receive regular ranks in the service. Our care to the wounded soldiers contributed to the decreasing the risk of infections, which contributed to the decrease in amputations and helped to save more lives. We were often placed in dangerous situations, and some of us also lost our lives. We ourselves dealt with infections of our fingers, exhaustion, and a lot of physical strain. In addition to my nursing duties, I was often pressed into service as an ambulance driver. It's difficult to describe what life was like over there. The war had been dragging on since 1914, but it wasn't until 1917, with the sinking of the ship Lusitania, that the U.S. joined in the Allied efforts to defeat Germany and the Axis powers. This was the war where airplanes became part of the wartime arsenal and more powerful and effective guns were developed. But the war was primarily a war of trench warfare. Soldiers were dug in on both sides. Sickness spread quickly, and because of the close quarters. Soldiers also suffered from trench foot because of the constant dampness. Their feet would swell and rot. We were also dealing with the effects of mustard gas and shell shock. We had to offer medical and emotional support. Despite all this, in September, I wrote home that there should be no more American nurses over there. There should be more American nurses over there. I thought the girls who didn't volunteer were slackers. I also wrote that despite everything, we were still able to have some good times. We'd take trips to Paris and go to the countryside. I liked the French people, and I was confident.
England, and I am here at my husband's graveside. Today was his body, you're free and clear. And so his whole design of the building was to facilitate getting rid of the bodies as quickly as he could. Now Patrick worked there and was having his time with some of the women that came in also to be polite around children. One of them became pregnant, Lizzie. And right at that time, the World's Fair was going to start up, and it was my chance to come and visit Patrick with Cora, and I was offered a job to work there as a housekeeper once the hotel opened, which I took the job. And Patrick started to panic and asked Dr. Holmes, could you deliver this baby? Deliver this baby so that my wife won't find out. And Holmes is thinking about it. They haven't really come up with a plan yet, but Lizzie says, I've already told my sister she's coming to visit. Well, Patrick then became involved. I can't say he was innocent. I know that the courts say he was innocent, he was exonerated, but he led those two women down to a room, shut the door, and he and Dr. Holmes turned on the gas, and that took care of the problem. It also promised and sealed Patrick's silence, because he could never say anything against Dr. Holmes, or he himself would suffer consequences, which would be hanging back in the day. Now, the way Dr. Holmes was captured was actually he had stolen a horse in Texas, and the news had gotten around, and they were going to come after him for that. He was terrified. You know what happens to horse thieves in Texas? He said, I will admit to the insurance scams. I didn't kill anybody. I'll admit to that. And so they took him in for that. As they investigated, the case that happened right before that they found out about was with Peitzel. His business partner Peitzel is very similar to the one I described. Peitzel had agreed to the scam, went up to Canada. His wife was called in to identify the body so they could get the money. Before she got there, Holmes says, by the way, that's not your husband. He's in Canada. Play the game. Your husband wants to get the money. So she agreed to identify him. And so she says, yes, that's my husband. They got the money. Well, and she even said later on, which is funny, that didn't look anything like him. It really was him, but she was convinced she was not identifying her husband. And she had brought her 3 children with her when she came to identify the body. Holmes, being the nice guy he is, offered to take the children from her because she had 2 more at home and she couldn't provide for all of them. So he took the 3 children. Long story short, he murdered the children and sold their little bodies to science. And the way he was caught with this, the police pulled a scam on him. They scammed a scammer. The body that he had gotten had no rigor mortis in it now. He claimed it was fresh, that he bought it from New York. Well, the police injected the body with a chemical that released the rigor mortis so that they could prove the timetable the way they wanted to get him to admit that he did it. So they tricked him into admitting the guilt when actually it wouldn't have. That it's complicated, and that's what I got. So sticking with that. So he's going to be hung. He doesn't seem afraid. He doesn't seem to care. He tells the hangman, "Hey, take your time." I mean, he's being so flippant up there. They hang him. His neck does not break, and he hangs for 20 minutes before he dies. So by the time they buried him, which he had an agreement, he wanted to be buried 10 feet under, not 6, and he wanted 6 tons of concrete poured into a very large hole to protect him from being exhumed and being mutilated or desecrated, because he was terrified of that. They agreed to do that. Now later on, I have the other group here, later on, and it was just in 2017, the body was exhumed. His great-grandchildren sued to have that happen, and they felt that that it was an imposter that was hung, and he actually went to London to become Jack the Ripper, which was a crime that was never solved. They never figured out who Jack the Ripper was. So they cracked open all the concrete, and it had been such a good mummification process because there was no oxygen in there, that he was totally intact. And they did looked at his teeth and identified him for sure. It really was him. He was not Jack the Ripper. And he was then reburied. So, did not solve that case. Let's see if there's anything else interesting. Yeah, I skipped and showed you reading. Any questions? It's going to be a movie.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So was the castle or the hotel in Chicago, was it actually a working hotel?
Yes. Yeah, they had one floor that was, the other floor was apartments.
So some of it was normal.
Some of it was normal. Not a lot. The women that came in there, and the number changes. He, in his testimony, admitted to 27 murders. The police say it's more like 9 or 10. This was written during the time of yellow journalism. Everything was sensationalized. And so the truth of everything I just told you could be next to nil. This is just what has grown to be. And they say every Halloween the death toll goes up every Halloween by about 100 deaths. So it's, who knows? Who knows?
So did he murder strictly so that he could sell the skeletons?
Mostly. He did it mostly for that, but he also did it for vengeance. He murdered one of his groundskeepers because the guy was going to squeal on him about an insurance scam. So he murdered him. He murdered the pregnant.
Right.
So there were 8 to 10 that he did murder in that way. And the rest were usually already dead bodies that he then reprocessed and sold.
Is the hotel still there?
No, it is not. It almost burnt once. They were going to make it into an attraction called the murder. Yeah. And it wound up being burnt to the ground after that. Now it's a post office. But if you look online, there's all kinds of stories about poltergeist activity there. It's sitting kind of halfway off of the old foundation. The post office is just on a part of it. But they say it's haunted. You can hear voice recordings that they've taken down there of crying and different things. It's horrendous.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's still there.
So where did you go when you left Portland?
I went back to Ohio with my family. I have a sister down there. And so we lived out our lives down there, and I was buried here next to my husband.
Again.
Very nice job.
Very nice job.
Thank you.
Everybody ready?
Ready. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Portland Cemetery. My name is Lucy Darling Harwood, and I'm here visiting my parents, Ephraim and Melissa. Now, I know some of you have been on these cemetery walks before, and I know you've heard about people like bankers and mill owners and politicians, but my father was a pioneer. He came here 174 years ago, in 1844, when he was just 2 years old. He traveled here from Greenfield, Ohio, with his parents and his sister Mariah, who was only 3. He was 2, she was 3, and they packed up everything they owned into what was called a prairie schooner. They brought it from Greenfield, Ohio, which is only a little over 300 miles from here. And by modern roads and on modern automobiles, that would take approximately 5 hours. But in a prairie schooner, which traveled at about 8 to 20 miles a day, that trip would have taken, at very best, 15 days, and more likely 30. They packed everything they owned into that prairie schooner. And the reason why they called it a prairie schooner was because of the shape of the wagon. The front end was bowed up as well as the back end. And that kept your belongings from rolling out when you went up or down a hill. Speaking of hills, which there were plenty on that trip, because these roads were not modern roads. They were basically a trail between the woods and the hills and all the territory, wild and open, between here and Greenfield. And the hills, as I say, became quite a problem because those wagons didn't even have brakes. So what they would do is they'd chain the back wheels to the carriage, or they'd stick a very strong pole between the spokes of the back wheels. That way, when they came down a hill, the wagon wouldn't roll over their axe team, which would cause a very big problem. Now, speaking of those wagons and all those belongings that they had to bring, you didn't bring furniture. You brought only your most cherished personal possessions and all the equipment and supplies, food, water, clothing, bedding that you would need to start a brand new home in a new area. Well, as I said, that was rough, wild territory. And there were very, very, very few settlements along the way. Well, at least very few settlements of people that we would recognize. Because the territory was covered with the indigenous people of the area. We called them Indians. Every once in a while, they would see a family of white settlers or possibly a trading wagon that would go by. But for the most part, they were on their own in the wild. And it was a dangerous trip. But grandfather had the future. Because in 1837, Michigan had become a state. And the federal government was all about giving land away. All they had to do was come up and claim their 45 acres in Section 26 of Orange. That would become Orange Township. And it's just a few miles west of here. And they would make their new home. Now, after that very long and arduous journey, they were so happy to see the 3 other white families that lived in the area, because that was civilization, and that was their new home. Now the hard work started, because once they got there, they had to clear the land. The first thing they had to do is they had to make an enclosure and a shelter for their animals. Then, of course, simultaneously, they'd clear land for crops, as well as building a cabin. Now, they did have those neighbors, and the neighbors helped out with surplus as best they could. But for the most part, no one would give away anything they needed to survive. So my grandparents lived off the land, the fertile land that had plenty of very
trees and fruit trees and nut trees and game, all you had to do was find it. So they lived in the wagon for a while until they got their cabin built, and then they began to build that farm family that you needed, because there were lots of hands that were needed to work the farm. So grandmother had a little girl named Hope, which she died very shortly after her. And then she had my uncles. Then she had another daughter, Celia, who died before her first birthday. But of the 10 children that grandmother and grandfather had, 6 boys and 2 girls lived to adulthood. And they all worked. My father was only 6 years old when he had to start performing chores on the farm every day. Now, lots of people said that it was a tough life, but Father said so eloquently as he was interviewed in 1912 as one of the oldest living settlers of Orange Township. May I quote? "You folks can scarce realize the hard times which prevailed in those days. While the high cost of living is causing much annoyance at the present time, the scarcity of foodstuffs was a source of much trouble and worry for us. Raising crops on undeveloped land is a task no present generation can comprehend, but we contended with this difficulty without even the slightest remorse. And we still managed to have fun. We would make social calls between neighbors, an evening trip of a half-dozen miles or so by means of an ox cart, with a nice jolly visit as the end of it, and after that, a midnight ride homeward made a pleasant break in an otherwise toilsome existence, and helped to cheer all hands. Well, anyway, 1862 came along, and so did the Civil War. And as grandmother was having her last child, my Uncle Orlando, her oldest son, my father, was going off to join the Union Army. Well, he said his service was nothing to brag about. I suppose he was thinking he wasn't the hero like Custer's Michigan Wolverines or the Iron Battalion's 24th Brigade, which fought so bravely at Gettysburg. But I always said, any service needed is a good service done. And because he got to stay so close to home, he was able to marry my mother, Melissa Eddy. My brother Wilbur was born at the end of the war in 1865, and I came along about a year later. Now there were 3 generations of our family working 120 acres of the most fertile land in Orange Township, which, by the way, now had its own post office and church. After the war, business really boomed, and Ionia and Portland became very, very busy centers of commerce. When 1869 brought the railroad, and then you had the freedom to travel and trade and buy and... Anyway, 1883 came along and my grandfather died. My father took over the farm, and my aunts and uncles were all living in neighboring areas on their own property. But still, the work was tedious. And when we plowed fields, we plowed everyone's fields. And when it came to planting and harvesting, we did the same. Everyone helped everyone else. I got married in 1882 when I was only 16 years old. And I married 2 times again in my lifetime. I had only 1 daughter, Inez, with my second husband. And my brother Wilbur got married to Pearl Warren, and he had his daughters Reva and Myrtle. Now we all stayed very close by to help out with the farm, especially when Mother became ill. She had what they call disease of the brain. We don't know exactly what it was, but we can imagine that it might have been migraine headaches. Whatever it was by today's standards, it left her an invalid for the last 25 years of her life. And that wasn't our only hardship. Well, it was spring of 1909, and the barn door came off the track and hit Father square in the head. It knocked him unconscious, and it paralyzed him on his right side. Well, he tried to maintain for a while, but it wasn't too long before he sold the farm to Alfred Whitlock for a tidy sum. He and Mother moved into the William Hall house over on Water Street, and just 2 weeks later, Mother passed away. Well, Father tried to maintain for a while, but it became too much work for him, and I realized he would have to move in with my husband and I. Well, the strokes of apoplexy became more and more frequent, and the last attack he had left him in a coma for 10 days, after which he passed, and we brought him back here to lie with my mother. Now, I talk about this like it's my story, but I'd like to tell you, if your last name is Darling, or Rice, or Rockwell, or Slaw, or Barhart, or Warren, or Thurston, or Greenfield, or Harwood, well, this isn't just my story and my history, it's your story.